We'll start off with a bit of a pop quiz this morning. So get ready. What do these dates have in common? October 19th, 1533. October 16th, 1736. October 23rd, 1997. And October 21st, 2011. Any ideas other than being in October what these dates have in common?
They were dates that people said the world was going to end.
Exactly. 5 points to you. Good job. You can get on Google and actually type in the phrase dates for the end of the world. And it is going to give you a list of, 75 or 100 dates that have been named from even before Jesus' time up to now that folks have predicted that the end of the world was going to occur or that the apocalypse was going to begin. Many of the folks that predicted these dates were Christians. And they looked to passages in the Bible, like this passage we have from the gospel today, and tried to read the signs that were pointing to the end times. If you look at this big list that we can find on the internet of all these end time dates, we can see that it really is part of our nature to make predictions about the end of the world. A lot of times these predictions were made during times of stress. The number goes up around the change of centuries and millennia. We get very nervous as we move into new measurements. But congratulations, you are still here. In my lifetime, we've survived several end-of-the-world predictions, including one on December 21st, 2012, right? That was the Mayan calendar came to an end. So you have survived the end of the world more times than you probably knew about. This gospel reading that we have today is a beginning portion of what is sometimes called the little apocalypse. It shows up not just in the Gospel of Luke, but also in Matthew and Mark, and each gospel relates the coming of the destruction of the temple and sets out signs for the end times. It's this reference to the destruction of the temple that was going to happen that leads scholars to date the writing of the Gospels to after the year 70, which is when the temple was actually destroyed. The destruction of the temple in Jerusalem was the event that changed Jewish life and changed the life of the emerging sect of Judaism that would later become called Christians. The scene for today's gospel in Luke takes place actually in the temple. Jesus is surrounded by folks that he's been speaking with. He's gone through this series of kind of question-answer confrontations in the temple, and this is a continuation of that scene. In reading it, I try to imagine what it must have been like to stand in the temple. It surely was one of the most beautiful buildings ever built. It was something made with huge stone walls, endless numbers of gates and rooms and porticos and porches and places that people gathered. It was a place that was alive with human activity and decorated with the finest things. This temple was built by Herod. We think of Herod as someone that did very not nice things to little baby boys when Jesus was born. But Herod was, the name Herod is associated with the great builder during this time because he rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem. It was a temple that was built to be the place that was the home for God amongst the Jewish people. And certainly standing there, it would not be unreasonable to ask yourself, how could this ever go away? but it would go away. Within 40 years of Jesus standing in the temple and preaching, the temple would erupt in flames. It would be defiled by Roman soldiers. It would be reduced to rubble, and it would very much seem like the end of the world. In our modern day experience, we don't necessarily have this common sense, this common connection to a single place. And we don't have a shared experience, of that single place being destroyed. In thinking about this gospel reading this week, I was trying to think what it must have felt like when you got word that the temple in Jerusalem had been destroyed. And I kept coming back to how I felt the morning after the tornado here. The night that it happened, it was dark. I didn't know exactly what had happened. All I did know is when I came into town, I was so thankful that DCH was still standing. But that next morning, when I went out to try to get to a friend of mine's house that I couldn't get on the telephone, I realized that the whole landscape had changed. All the familiar trees and signs and buildings that I used to get around town were lost. I finally had to give up and use my GPS to get to where I was going. And for months after that storm, I talked to people that all shared this same story over and over again about how it felt to be lost in a place that we thought we always knew how to get to where we were going. In a small way, that sense of disconnect and that loss must have been what it felt like to know that the temple, the center of Jewish life, had been destroyed. When all of your life was organized around this one place and now it was gone, there were a lot of folks that were scared and lost. If we add into this that during the early days of the Christian church, many followers were facing violence and persecution, we can certainly understand why the writer of Luke puts this gospel reading here. See, it's kind of a funny thing. So many Christians read this passage to try to predict the future. They forget the fact that this passage was written for a very particular time and place. Luke was writing to people that existed in a world to where the whole center of their life had been destroyed, where persecution was real, and then so Jesus speaks to that moment and to that experience. But the amazing thing about the gospel is even this story that's written to a people experiencing this so long ago still has something to say to us today. I started listing off a small sample of dates that predicted the end times. We continue as a people to deal with stress and life-changing events by trying to put order to it, by trying to read signs and predict the end. We want to make sense of things. But if we fall into the trap of looking for when the end time is going to happen, we miss the point of this gospel. Jesus tells us some very clear, plain things. He tells us, do not be led astray by folks saying that the time is near. Do not be terrified when wars are happening, and do not prepare a defense to the persecution that may come. See, for Christians, the end times aren't really our concern. While it's in our human nature to worry about it, as Christians, fear of the end can never be our motivating force. Those folks that make these predictions, I think, do so out of fear of a changing world, fear of losing control, fear of responding to popular culture that doesn't make sense anymore, the fear of a new prayer book. Fear is what leads us to look for signs of the end times, and it's natural. But fear is not our story anymore. As Christians, we are invited to leave that fear behind. We're invited into a different story, a story of life and resurrection, of forgiveness and grace, and of love and service. That perhaps is the good news from this gospel. Jesus tells us clearly that even in times when it seems like the whole world is turned upside down, we do not have to be afraid. In times of trial and persecution, Jesus will be there with us, and it is his words and wisdom that we can rely on. We are called not to be distracted by those that make decisions out of fear and anxiety, but instead we are called to endure in the life of being a Christian, to endure in being a voice of hope and love, to endure in feeding the hungry, taking care of the poor, and to loving each other in community. We are called to endure at times of disaster or tragedy by reaching out and responding to the needs of those around us, not with judgment and predictions of the end, but with the message of resurrection. There was a song that I used to listen to when I was in high school by REM, a band. The title of it was, "It is the End of the World as We Know It." And then the next line is, "And I feel fine." That is our call as Christians. Amen.